Good day to everyone. It's my pleasure to be speaking to you today, unfortunately via a computer screen. My name is Tiina Pajuste, and I am an associate professor of international and European law at Tallinn University. For the next hour, I'll be speaking to you mostly on the topic of the right to inclusion in peace processes, but I will start off with a short overview of my research, teaching, and societal and institutional activity in the past 5 years. So to start off with, I will talk about research. So in the past 5 years, I've been involved with 4 projects that have been at least partly research focused. These are mentioned on the slide. I will do a short overview of the 2 larger projects. So first, I was part of the team of the Legal Tools for Peacemaking project based at the University of Cambridge. I wrote the grant proposal together with Professor Mark Weller and initially led the daily activities of the project team until I relocated to Tallinn. The project collaborated very closely with the UN Mediation Support Unit, which is part of the Department of Political Affairs of the UN. And it also collaborated with the academic and practitioner advisory boards, which included leading experts in peacemaking from around the world. So the project had 4 mutually reinforcing objectives. So first, presenting for the first time the vast practice revealed through peace agreements on an issue-by-issue basis, making it instantly accessible to practitioners and academics. And then deriving from this practice, realistic settlement options for use in actual peace negotiations, and making these settlement options available to the United Nations, the African Union, the EU, and other mediating agencies. A third, analyzing this practice in relation to each issue area against the background of general international law with a view to identifying advances or deviations from universal legal standards. And fourth, establishing how the international system addresses possible deviations from universal standards in this area of law and how this might affect the coherence and stability of the international legal system. So overall, the project conducted a detailed study of peace agreements and mediation practices. And we analyzed the impact of the rules of international law on this formation of the terms and conditions of peace treaties and the extent to which international law restricts the freedom of mediators to propose solutions to the parties of the conflict. I personally dealt in depth with the issues of elections, security sector reform, the rights of vulnerable groups, and inclusion. And the main academic output of the project was the large edited volume on international law and peace settlements published by Cambridge University Press at the start of this year. So the image of that book is on the slide. Second, I was one of the 6 academics involved in the Tallinn University-led Horizon 2020 project Hurmur, Human Rights, Mutually Raising Excellence. And the partners were the Danish Institute of Human Rights and the Walter Schücking Institute of International Law at the University of Kiel. It was a twinning project with the aim of expanding the world-class research area of human rights in Europe. The main objectives of the projects were the establishment and publication of a new regional peer-reviewed academic journal, then strengthened research capacities of Tallinn University on the universality of human rights narratives and discourses, and on new human rights, as well as increased publication activity in this area. And third, increased dissemination and communication of Tallinn University research and knowledge to the public, policymakers, legislators, and civil society. As a result of the project, we published various articles, composed an edited book on new human rights, which was published by Cambridge University Press, created a new international human rights journal, the East European Yearbook on Human Rights, organized several conferences and summer schools, and increased the networks of the participating academics. So my chapter in the edited book was on the status of human rights of older persons. And the 3rd issue of the East European Yearbook on Human Rights was published at the end of last year, and I continue to be the assistant editor of the journal. So this concludes this short overview of the highlights of my research in the past 5 years. Moving on to teaching. I've had a very high teaching load in the past 5 years. I've taught around 40 to 50 credits or 8 courses per year, which is the mandatory teaching load for lecturers at Tallinn University. And this has been the main obstacle for increasing my research output. I've mostly been teaching law undergraduate and postgraduate students on international law in courses like international organizations, international criminal law, international and European Union environmental law, moot court, and impact of international law on domestic law. And I've also taught international relations master's students on the basics of international law. I try to engage students in my classes, and I use a range of different teaching methods like discussions, debates, flipped classroom, case analysis, and group work. And feedback to my courses has been overwhelmingly positive, with my courses given an average grade of around 4.6 out of 5 in student feedback. And then moving on to societal and institutional activity in the past 5 years. In the past 5 years, I've tried to increase my popular science and societal activities. I've increased the writing of scientific publications in Estonian and developed communication with the media and society. Also, I've trained a number of public officials and staff of private companies in the field of personal data protection. I have also been involved in the activities of the Estonian school system. So among other things, I have held law lessons at the Tallinn University Student Academy and organized a debate for schools on the subject of the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize for Human Rights. And I'm also on the editorial board of the Estonian Academy of Sciences Constitutional Law Endowment, which has a book project regarding a commentary of the Constitution. And this will allow me to further increase my participation in local research networks. On the international level, I have participated in the work of professional organizations like the International Law Association and the European Society of International Law, and expanded my networks in the framework of the different projects that I've been involved with. I'm a member of a large number of institutional bodies of Tallinn University. For example, the Sogolas Research Colloquium, Board of Studies, electoral committees, admission committees, and I've actively and consistently contributed to Sogolas development and administrative activities. I have also been involved in the process of developing 2 university-wide courses. One is studying in higher education, and the other one is the life course. Since 2015, I've been the study program administrator of the Estonian language law curricula, and I have systematically dealt with the analysis and improvement of curricula in this role. And during the period, several external evaluation processes have taken place where I've participated in the preparation of these self-analyses, as well as in meetings with evaluators. And as a study program administrator, I've created or improved various instructional materials in the field of law and dealt with a plethora of administrative tasks. And at the international level, I have also been involved in activities with a social impact. One significant achievement was the launch in 2016 of the Language of Peace database. I was one of the main creators of this analytical database of international peace agreements, and this was developed in collaboration with the Legal Tools for Peacemaking project team, the UN Mediation Support Unit, and the IT developers from Past, Present, Future. And the database provides instant searchable access to the provisions of around 1,000 peace agreements, and they're categorized according to the issues that they address, from negotiating agendas through human rights to power sharing agreements. And this database aims to transform negotiations by giving all the parties an open access tool that contains decades of peace agreement practice. And this has a very important practical impact, which was acknowledged by the representatives of the various international organizations to whom we introduced the database. So the database was introduced to the United Nations, the Organization of American States, and the African Union. So I will now move to the main focus of my presentation and talk about the right to inclusion in peace processes. So my lecture is based on the chapter on inclusion and women in peace processes that I wrote on the basis of research done in the Legal Tools for Peacemaking project. Inclusion is an issue that has received a lot of attention in recent years, at least in the framework of international organizations. So the aim of my chapter was to look at what the basis for inclusion is. Is there a legal obligation, or to put more softly, a legal justification for this? So the slide shows the outline of both the chapter and the lecture. I will start by looking at why there is a need to include different actors, what are the risks involved, and then move on to explore where a potential obligation for inclusion comes from and what the content of that obligation is. I will do this firstly by looking at relevant international legal norms, and secondly, looking at the instruments adopted by international organizations. And I will finish by drawing some conclusions regarding process design of peace negotiations in relation to inclusion. So when I was writing the chapter, I asked myself a series of questions that I will present to you as well in red on the slides. So the first was, what is meant by inclusion? What is inclusion? So the term inclusion has been used in various different contexts. It can refer to the policy of talking to all conflict parties, irrespective of their role and behavior during conflict. So not excluding perpetrators of war crimes. Inclusion is also used to advocate for the rights of relevant groups and sectors of society to have a say in process. And moreover, inclusion can be understood to involve an individual right of participation that belongs to each and every individual. And the actors involved in peace processes can also have different understandings of what exactly inclusion means in each stage or track of the peace process. Inclusion as a principle doesn't provide a concrete answer to the question, who should be included? And that answer can depend on the context and the specific circumstances involved, which may decrease some of the practical value of this principle. Then the second question was, why is there a need for inclusion? What is to be gained from it? The main potential benefits of inclusion are listed on the slide. The UN Secretary General's 2012 report mentioned most of these. It states that, I quote, an inclusive process is more likely to identify and address the root causes of conflict and ensure that the needs of the affected sectors of the population are addressed. Inclusivity also increases the legitimacy and national ownership of the peace agreement and its implementation. In addition, it reduces the likelihood of excluded actors undermining the process. But of course, there are also aspects of inclusion that may create problems for peace processes. For example, the more groups you involve, the more difficult it will be to control the process and the more interests you have to accommodate. Reaching compromises may become more complicated, as the different groups can have very different priorities, and there may be more aspects that are unacceptable under any circumstances for the actors involved. Moreover, not all the groups can make a genuine effort in the process, and some groups may reflect and advocate for very extreme views. And there is no guarantee that all actors will want to end the conflict through peaceful means. So inclusion can have the effect of making the process of achieving peace more difficult and more lengthy. So the next question I asked myself was, is there a legal basis for inclusion? International law doesn't explicitly regulate the area, but there are a few relevant rules that can provide some guidance. Such rules don't prescribe specific action, but they provide a normative framework to guide and evaluate the conduct of relevant actors in terms of applicable international standards. The relevant international law rules are those relating to participation, representation, and the rights to voice your opinion and to have it heard. So the rules that are most relevant to inclusion are the right to vote and to take part in public affairs, the right to self-determination, and the prohibition of discrimination. Self-determination gives people the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. It was conceived to facilitate the decolonization process. But in the post-colonial era, it developed to gain an additional meaning, known as internal self-determination. This aspect of self-determination implies meaningful participation in the process of government. The right to self-determination is a group right, and it can be somewhat problematic to derive any individual rights from it. But self-determination as a principle can serve as an overarching framework for understanding and implementing connected civil and political rights. In the context of peace processes, the right to self-determination could be understood as the right of the people to participate in and influence these processes, because the peace process can have a fundamental impact on the economic, social, and cultural development of the state and the people within it. Self-determination is a concept that is based on the belief that it is the people of a state that should determine its fate. So this concept can be linked to inclusion in peace processes to highlight the fact that the voice of the people should be heard in this context, and that the needs of the people should be addressed. Although self-determination may not yet provide wide-reaching rights to different groups in the post-conflict context, if some sectors of society are completely excluded from post-conflict processes, and this happens for a prolonged period, a potential violation of the right to self-determination could take place. And since there is conceptual compatibility between self-determination and inclusion, it could plausibly develop in the direction of providing specific rights to be included in peace processes if there is sufficient support for it. But this would be quite a jump from the current state of affairs, as self-determination is generally seen as providing specific enforceable rights only in the extreme circumstances of oppression. Then the second international legal rule that is relevant for inclusion is the right to vote and take part in the conduct of public affairs. It is easier to connect this right to the later stages of peace processes, which include broader political processes after the end of the conflict, than to connect it with the initial stages of peace processes, which is the negotiation stage. As this is a right to take part in the conduct of public affairs, could peace processes be considered such public affairs? The Human Rights Committee General Comment on Article 25 defined the conduct of public affairs as, I quote, a broad concept which relates to the exercise of political power, in particular the exercise of legislative, executive, and administrative powers. It covers all aspects of public administration and the formulation and implementation of policy at international, national, regional, and local levels. So in principle, there is no incompatibility with this statement and considering peace processes to be part of conducting public affairs, as making choices in those processes can be seen as the formulation of policy at the different levels that I mentioned. But this right leaves a lot of discretion for states. The Human Rights Committee added that, I quote, the allocation of powers and the means by which individual citizens exercise this right should be established by the Constitution and other laws. And this was also affirmed by the committee in Marshall versus Canada, where it held that it remains to be determined what is the scope of the right of every citizen without unreasonable restrictions to take part in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives. It is for the legal and constitutional system of the state party to provide for the modalities of such participation. This broad discretion of states means that it is difficult to make the claim that certain specific inclusion activities are required under this article in the context of peace processes. The impact of the discretion is further increased by the fact that most important formulation of this right in Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights comes with exceptions built into it. The article states that the right is to be exercised without unreasonable restrictions. So this wording implies that placing reasonable restrictions on the exercise of this right is allowed. So this clause could be abused to justify making far-reaching restrictions on the right to take part in the conduct of public affairs. On the other hand, it could also be possible to use this clause in relation to peace processes to limit the participation of certain groups if their views or actions are incompatible with the objective of those processes, or if their participation would completely derail the process. The legitimate aims that may be pursued through such actions could be the establishment of political stability and security, protection of other groups, or reconciliation. So a broad discretion is always left to the states in the application of this provision, which makes it plausible that avoiding some of the problems that may arise in peace processes would be considered a sufficient justification for restrictions. Another factor that diminishes the potential impact of the legal norms I've mentioned in relation to peace processes is the derogation clause contained in Article 4 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that gives states the option to derogate from their obligations under the covenant in time of public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation. That article also lists the rights from which you cannot derogate under any circumstances. But the right to vote and to take part in the conduct of public affairs is not included in that list, and neither is the right to self-determination. So a state could rely on this option to derogate. There are some conditions for this derogation, but nothing too concrete. The Human Rights Committee, in its General Comment 29 on Article 4, stressed that for a suspension of rights to be valid, a state must be able to justify not only that such a situation constitutes a threat to the life of the nation, but also that all their measures derogating from the covenant are strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. Recent experience of conflict in a state does not by itself justify a derogation. So situations when the derogation could be used in a post-conflict setting include a situation where there is a clear connection between an activity required by human rights and a return to extensive violence. You could imagine that including certain groups in peace processes could provoke violence if the parties to the conflict are fiercely against such participation. So in such circumstances, the derogation clause would offer a legal basis for postponing the implementation of the right to political participation. Thirdly, the fundamental principles of equality and non-discrimination also provide general guidance in the post-conflict context and in relation to inclusion. Whenever specific measures or activities are planned, there is a need to analyze whether they are in accordance with the rule of non-discrimination. Human rights instruments ban discrimination on various grounds. Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights prohibits discrimination on the following 10 grounds: race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, and other status. In the context of inclusion activities, it is significant that the Human Rights Council has declared that the principle of equality sometimes requires states parties to take affirmative action in order to diminish or eliminate conditions which cause or help to perpetuate discrimination prohibited by the covenant. So it can be justified to create inclusion mechanisms that provide specific rights or more rights to groups that have suffered discrimination in the past. For example, addressing gender-based discrimination. International law can provide rights in relation to inclusion in peace processes, but it can also place restrictions. For example, human rights norms or anti-terrorism rules may be inconsistent with ensuring the widest possible participation in peace negotiations. The designation of an armed group as a terrorist organization, for instance, may have an impact on the ability of such groups to participate in the peace processes. And in the opinion of some scholars, international law does not allow states to grant amnesty for certain crimes, such as genocide, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, or torture, because that would violate the treaties that forbid these actions. So rules prohibiting the granting of amnesties to conflict parties that have committed atrocities can lead to those parties not being willing to negotiate an end to the conflict, as they would face prosecution and severe consequences for their actions during the armed conflict. Therefore, in practice, many states and the United Nations have either granted or acknowledged, either explicitly or implicitly, different forms of amnesty for international crimes. So it is clear that international law doesn't provide detailed guidance regarding inclusion in the post-conflict situation, but there are relevant rules that provide a framework to be taken into consideration when inclusion activities are being discussed and implemented. So international legal rules currently provide a legal justification for inclusion, but in principle, they could also develop in a way that justifies and specifies legal obligations. So although international legal norms don't demand any specific inclusion activities in peace processes, inclusion has gained prominence in recent years, and this is mostly due to the importance that international organizations have placed on inclusivity initiatives. Inclusion has found its way to numerous policy documents of the United Nations and regional organizations. And these include the Sustaining Peace and Prevention Agenda, 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security, and Resolution 2250 on Youth, Peace and Security, as well as the study by the World Bank and the UN on pathways for peace. All of these instruments conclude that inclusion is necessary for prevention of violence, for peace building, and for sustainable political systems. But in general, they don't say anything specific about the methods or requirements of inclusion. So another difficult question is who exactly needs to be included? And is this the same no matter what the circumstances are? So several documents just refer to civil society or stakeholders. For example, 2012 definition of inclusivity referred to the extent and manner in which the views and needs of conflict parties and other stakeholders are represented and integrated into the process and outcome of a mediation effort. Other documents have specific references to certain groups, such as women and youth. For example, the report of the Secretary General on peace building in the aftermath of conflict stressed that, I quote, "A successful peace-building process must be transformative and create space for a wider set of actors, including but not limited to representatives of women, young people, victims and marginalized communities, community and religious leaders, civil society actors, and refugees and internally displaced persons to participate in public decision-making on all aspects of post-conflict governance and recovery." Because of the gender mainstreaming policy, explicit references to women started making an appearance in documents before references to other groups. And even if you know what categories of groups should be included, deciding which specific entities to approach in each conflict situation is even more difficult. So the different documents show that although maximum inclusion is advocated, it is also recognized that the circumstances of the situation may call for a less ambitious approach and justify a gradual increase in participation. For example, the report of the Secretary General on strengthening the role of mediation in the peaceful settlement of disputes acknowledged that in some circumstances, more exclusive dialogue with conflict parties may be required to move the process forward expeditiously, for example, in negotiating ceasefires, especially where the parties feel too exposed politically or if their security may be compromised. Other studies have found that inclusivity does not require that all stakeholders participate in every single phase of a peace process. If in one phase it was not possible to have wide participation, then there should be more of an effort to ensure this in the next phase. In addition, the same mediation report stated that an inclusive process does not imply that all stakeholders participate directly in the formal negotiations, but instead it should facilitate interaction between the conflict parties and other stakeholders and create mechanisms to include all perspectives in the process. And as an example of such a mechanism, the use of dialogue initiatives at the national or local level is mentioned. Another standard for conduct, evident from the relevant instruments and also expressed in a statement by the President of the Security Council, is the requirement of supporting national efforts to include relevant national actors in peacebuilding activities and processes. In addition, the UN guidance for effective mediation states that mediators should ensure that negotiating parties have sufficient knowledge, information, and skills to negotiate with confidence. Therefore, capacity building is included in the requirement of promoting inclusivity. Part of capacity building is making sure that the relevant groups have the necessary information. The guidance for effective mediation foresees that different forms of media, including social media and opinion polls, should be used to inform and engage the public and identify potential points of contention. So there is no blueprint that peace processes always follow. Peace processes consist of different stages and activities, each of which can vary in scope and length, depending on the particular circumstances of the specific conflict. The main stages of peace processes tend to be negotiations, formulation of the peace agreements, post-World War peace building, and reconciliation. And these stages and processes can also have different tracks. For example, different issue areas may be negotiated in distinct venues, and the mediators and the parties involved may not necessarily overlap. And there may not be a linear progression in the stages or the tracks of the peace processes, which makes them very complex structures, but it can also facilitate flexibility. As international law doesn't currently demand any specific actions in relation to inclusion in the different stages of peace processes, inclusivity can be approached as an overarching aim to be achieved over the process as a whole. So it doesn't matter through which particular stage or track popular involvement is fulfilled, as long as the final outcome is that the people have had a meaningful say in the process. So this can be achieved through diverse methods in different stages and tracks, including direct or representative participation in negotiations, popular consultation, especially through civil society groups, voting in electoral processes, and eligibility to stand for election to the post-conflict legislative or executive bodies, national dialogue processes, and referenda on the peace act settlement or associated constitutional reforms. As the aim of peace negotiations is achieving the end of conflict and a peaceful future, it is justifiable to prioritize efficiency of peace negotiations and limit the extent of inclusion in that stage. Efficiency in this context relates to the speed and ease of reaching agreement, which is facilitated when the number of participants is limited. There is a need to tailor each process to the urgency of objectives and the viability of what can be achieved. So once a basic level of stability and cooperation has been achieved, the ambition regarding inclusion can be increased. And if in one phase or track, it's not possible to have wide participation, then there should be then more effort to ensure this in the next phase or other complementary tracks. And if you cannot have broad participation in negotiations, then it's important to ensure that inclusion activities are incorporated into the text of the peace agreement. For example, holding elections or a referendum, creating a national dialogue process, different consultation mechanisms, or foreseeing a constitution-making process. On the other hand, opponents of phasing raise the argument that not including women or certain societal groups in the negotiation stage creates consequences that cannot be remedied in later stages of the peace process. If their unique expertise or knowledge of certain local conditions is not utilized in negotiations, then it is not reflected in the peace agreement, and it can be difficult to draw focus later on to issues that are not included in the formal terms of a settlement. So as a consequence, vital issues may be sidelined. Another issue that may arise as a result of limiting initial participation is that the domestic elites that were in power before the conflict and perhaps were involved in creating the conditions that led to the violence initially, so those powers may stay in power in the post-conflict situation, and this in turn can give rise to renewed violence in the future if no meaningful change is achieved. So summing up, there are a lot of difficult questions and decisions that have to be made in the peace processes, and choices regarding inclusion are some of them. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of reasons why it is worth pursuing inclusivity in peace processes. It can help to ensure that the root causes of conflict and the concerns of the different societal groups are addressed in the peace agreement. Inclusion is also consistent with international law. Although international law doesn't provide detailed rules on inclusivity that regulate post-conflict situations, foundational principles like self-determination and human rights norms like the right to vote confirm the relevance of inclusion and provide some guidance. More detailed requirements regarding inclusion have been self-imposed by the United Nations and other international organizations in numerous policy documents. All the instruments that have been adopted by the organizations emphasize the importance of inclusion for the prevention of violence, for peace building, and for sustainable political systems. And over the years, the requirements of inclusion in these policy documents have become more specific, although there are still many broad statements about inclusivity in these documents. And the relevant overarching legal norms have provided the framework, and the soft law norms are gradually developing these overarching norms into more concrete obligations. Although maximum inclusion is often advocated by scholars and laid down as a goal in policy documents, at times the circumstances of the situation may justify limiting participation or delaying inclusion initiatives for the greater aim of maintaining peace in a volatile situation. Gradually broadening inclusion can be seen as an acceptable compromise to lower the risks of inclusion while trying to maximize the benefits. So in this context, the principles of equality and non-discrimination are especially important, as they dictate that no matter what level of inclusion is chosen for a particular stage of the peace process, inclusion methods cannot be unjustifiably discriminatory. Exclusions on the basis of gender, beliefs, race, and other grounds are not allowed unless they pursue legitimate aims, are based on reasonable and objective criteria, and are proportionate to the achievement of those aims. So that wraps up my presentation on the right to inclusion. Thank you for listening. And are there any questions or comments too?
So thank you very much. So if you have questions, please go on. And thank you, Tiina.
If I may, Dennis, I have a few questions, if I can start. So first of all, thank you very much for very comprehensive and well argumented and well presented lecture. I have two specific questions. One is related to the matter of derogation. You indicated correctly that under international law, countries are allowed to derogate from certain obligations which they have under international law. There is an imminent threat to the livelihood of the entire nation. Bringing this to the current situation in the world, I have always wondered whether one could say that this pandemic of COVID-19 could be characterized as such a threat. And I'm just asking for your opinion, because probably the conclusion, if it can be characterized as such a threat or not, will be known in the future. So I'm asking for your opinion, and on reflecting upon that, perhaps you could give some insights from your side to what criteria this threat to the livelihood of the entire nation would need to correspond. So that is my first question.
Okay, very interesting question, and I think many scholars have been reflecting on that over the past year. And I think we cannot give one overarching answer on whether the COVID-19 pandemic qualifies as a threat to the livelihood of an entire nation, because the situation is very different in the different countries. So in some states where they managed to control the disease effectively from the first stages, there was no significant impact on either economic or other conditions in the state. Whereas in other states, like, for example, Estonia, where the situation has been out of control, it can really, for a prolonged period, impact the activity of the state and the welfare and well-being of the individuals living in that state. So I think, I don't know of, I couldn't give you the list of the specific criteria, what to take into consideration in assessing this, but I think definitely the severity of the impact, the length of the situation, the various sectors of the state existence that are involved would all be kind of conditions and aspects that need to be taken into consideration in giving this assessment.
Thank you. And it is something that one could discuss long and long. My second question is related to the matter of self-determination. We all know that in Estonian constitution, the second sentence is that Estonian people have the right to national self-determination, which seems almost an absolute right. So I'm just wondering, could we claim, or would it be justified to say that in addition to the very short list of absolute rights which exist today in the human rights sphere, the right to self-determination could be added as an absolute right? Or is there a difference originating from the fact that usually we think of absolute rights which are individual rights, but the right to self-determination is defined as a group right, or the right of the people? And that is my second question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Also a very, very interesting topic. So I think it depends on how you give meaning to the term. So I think if you consider it that as a foundational principle, it can be considered absolute. But if you attach specific actions or specific rights that people can demand, then perhaps those rights cannot be demanded in every situation. So this these nuances would be derogable, but as a core concept, I think it can be lifted to a higher stage, because in principle, all of the states should be based on the interest of its people. And I do believe that perhaps there could be differences on individual versus group rights, and what particular benefits would it be if an individual itself cannot go to the court and say, I have this absolute right to have self-determination. So what additional benefits would it have? So I think there's arguments for both sides, as in most cases in legal discussions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think Birgit has a hand raised.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Tiina, for your presentation. And it was great that you outlined a lot of, I think, interesting points that are related to international law. But if we would now look at inclusion in peace processes from an international security perspective in international relations as a more interdisciplinary focus, then can you maybe comment on how that literature talks about these issues? Because I think your presentation was very much, towards the international law perspective. So I wonder if you want to add something to that.
Thank you. Of course, these are issues that have been actually mostly discussed in other realms of literature rather than legal literature. So that's why kind of the unique contribution that I brought to the scholarship was to give a more legal analysis of this. But of course, when you look at the international security studies and their scholarship in the area, there's a lot of focus on the efficiency of peace processes and the what are the kind of the benefits and the drawbacks of including the different groups. So I think I addressed that in the earlier part of my presentation, where I discussed what is the need and what are the benefits and what are the negative aspects of inclusion. And so a lot of the literature sees inclusion as an obstacle to the kind of success of peace negotiations. So that is definitely something to bear in mind, that you cannot demand this in a way that it will kind of defeat the main aim of what is trying to be achieved. Okay, Koidu and Tanel have their hands up.
Yes, thank you also for the great presentation about your research interests and focuses. I would like to ask, as a research coordinator in our school, that what kind of interdisciplinary focus points or cooperation points you see inside our school, and also maybe at Tallinn University in a wider sense, if we are thinking that this tenure professor will be like a flagship and will engage a lot of research groups, or at least one bigger around her or him, so that if you could open this viewpoints from this side, I would be thankful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that is one of the areas where we can still improve in Tallinn University. We have these big aims of doing a lot of collaboration and cooperation, but there haven't been that many, at least successful initiatives. So I think there are very different areas where there is potential for collaboration. What I, as a new type of focus area that I thought of would be kind of to focus on the activity of international organizations from all sorts of different aspects. So since one of my research tracks has been on the activity of international organizations, and it's connected to this governance issue that our institute is trying to promote as well. So I see a lot of points of contact in the research activity of the different scholars in the different study areas that we have going on. But of course, I haven't done an in-depth study and discussed this with colleagues because of, this is an early stage of the process of being selected to this position.
Yes, thank you. But would you name some kind of very practical processes, what you would like to plan, how to initiate all this cooperation, to identify the interested researchers, how to motivate them? Because this role of tenure professor, it's a very special role. And how do you see how you can initiate something what is not working or working well at the moment?
Mm-hmm. So the basis for collaboration, like how we could initiate it, it's contact. It's knowing what your colleagues are doing. And I think that is one of the problems that we have is everybody is in their own corridor. There's not a lot of interaction. There are seminars, for example, the Research Colloquium organizes the seminars where everybody is invited to attend, but they're not so popular. And if you don't know your colleagues, you're not going to start a project with them. So I think an informal event, so where there would be presentations by each of the study area people who are interested and are willing to collaborate, who would do short overviews of their research projects in a way and in a language that speaks to everyone. So often the problem is that academics use language that is only accessible to people in their own discipline. So this would be kind of a popular science internal Sokolas kind of a friendship day, or getting to know each other, or really making these kind of first steps that there have been, on paper, we've looked at the profiles of people who are doing research and trying to find connections. But if you don't have that personal relationship with a colleague, you don't feel comfortable enough to write a grant application to them. You need to find the colleagues that you can really work as a team with, work in depth. And for that, I think we need more interaction. We need, as I said in my little research statement, that I think this kind of coffee hour where every time there's 2 study areas together and there's, I don't know, a practical problem or issue that we can discuss in that 1 hour, that would be kind of a first step towards creating this long-term collaboration that's missing.
Thank you very much.
Daniel had.
Yeah, thank you. I thank you very much for the inspiring lecture, and of course we could talk for a long time about it. Probably some just ideas. I see a perspective of interdisciplinarity here, because, well, having negotiations, it's not just something that happens in the international sphere or in a political sphere after a conflict and so that you have been focused on. But certainly it could be also something that precedes, for instance, decisive referendum, I recalled for Brexit, for instance, when something was decided without really negotiating and having the interests of different groups put on the stake. So it's not so much a question, but a question I have as well. You told about the rights that could be derogated, human rights, but there are also rules that may not be derogated according to the understanding of international law. And one of them is the principle of sovereignty of state. Do you see a conflict there?
So again, this is a complex situation. So in peace processes, the state is often being reinvented, and it's difficult to tell who is the sovereign and what kind of role it can play. So already that makes it problematic. So if you believe that the people are the representation of sovereignty in that context, then you make different conclusions than if you believe that the old state institutions are the ones that are representing state sovereignty. So, but definitely, these are all difficult aspects that you have to take into consideration. So the peace process is a very delicate machine, and you have to be both accommodating to state power, to the relevant rules, but also to the practicalities. And the fact that mediators themselves may have different priorities and different rules that bind them. So that's why it can cause problems that the UN, for example, has self-imposed additional rules to abide by that are not necessarily binding on the other parties to the conflict. So there are definitely conflicts built into the system. And I agree with your comment that in this area as well, there is definitely room for interdisciplinary research. So I would also, propose this topic to, or, inclusion in a wider kind of sense, and these processes that lead to different outcomes. And that could be also a topic that we will look into in our institute. But again, it's difficult to know what the interests of colleagues from different areas are. So that's why I believe that we need to have this initial interaction to get to know each other's interests in more depth.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the time is up. So
yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Tiina. And sorry that the very introduction of the lecture was in Estonian, but actually the lecture was what did matter. So maybe it wasn't such a big thing. But now we move on with the next candidate later on. But please log out and then switch to another Zoom link, because we have different Zoom links for different lectures. Thank you.